it's jaw-dropping, really. It is the state Supreme Court decision on the income tax on capital gains. And one thing you'll note here, despite the decision, is unless I've directed otherwise, I'm going to always call it the income tax on capital gains because it's on income. To talk about that decision with us, Jason Mercier, our Center for Government Reform director, has joined us. His research on the subject is second to none, and he was identified as expert, used as some of his research as expert testimony in the decision at the Superior Court level when it was ruled unconstitutional rightly, and then suddenly our court, the state Supreme Court, got a hold of it and found all kinds of interesting ways to create a decision desired. Jason, why don't you just describe to us big picture what happened with that decision?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And I promise you I will be more composed in this update than when we last spoke, because we were on the phone live as that opinion came down, and you kind of got the unfiltered full analysis, and we'll keep this one family friendly. As you indicated, Washington State Supreme Court in a 7-2 decision decided that notwithstanding the tax analysis of the rest of the world, Washington State alone has discovered how to tax income as an excise tax, and ruled that the capital gains tax is not an income tax, despite what the IRS and every other state and every other country say. It is, in fact, an excise tax. So I'm kind of with you. I do want to give due deference and respect to our court, but I'm going to stand with the rest of the world and keep calling it an income tax just for consistency. But where we are now, that tax is in full force and effect. It is due on April 18th. And going forward, we're going to have to see how much mischief our legislation decides to have with what the Supreme Court has provided them.
Well, one of the big problems I have is that the language is so clear, it doesn't seem subject to interpretation, that property is anything tangible or intangible subject to ownership. And we know that this particular tax, in fact, the court is aware of this, that the tax is based on the income received after a transaction, not on the transaction, thus an excise tax, but based on the income received from the transaction, which is subject to ownership and therefore subject to the 1% cap and the rest. But somehow they acknowledge that, while at the same time just arbitrarily saying, well, it's a tax on the transaction. I mean, it's a bizarre butchery of language and its meaning to me.
Yeah, when you look at the majority opinion that was written by 7 justices, it reads like a really good opinion editorial you would see in the Seattle Times. It was very heavy on rhetoric, very heavy on policy, very light on legal interpretation of the incidence of the tax. And the dissent, again, it only got 2 votes, but the dissent was beautiful. It was clear, it was factual, and it was consistent with how capital gains are treated across the world. And the dissenting justices basically said, this is obviously clearly an income tax, and underneath our Constitution, defining income to be property, a 7% tax with these exemptions is clearly unconstitutional. And the justices also pointed out in the dissent that the IRS and everybody else in the world agrees with this. And to the rhetoric that was in the majority opinion, the dissenting justices said that rhetoric may be true, but the proper venue for this debate is with a constitutional amendment. It's not the role of the judiciary to impose an income tax by fiat.
It was fascinating to me. I saw a column in the Seattle Times. I think you sent it around. There was a law professor just before this decision was handed down who was writing about how, Matt McElwain's column, for example, one of our board members, it really didn't apply to this case so much because it was a moral argument. He was making arguments in the case that were not necessarily relevant, like, about how effective our tax system is, whether or not capital would flee, how, the moral case of, is it regressive or too regressive, or is it the right, the right way? And how it affects the poor. And so, the law professor was saying none of that really applies to the court, because the court's just going to balance the language of the law. And then as you read the decision, as you point out, so much of this language is all about what's fair and what's not fair. And then they bring up this idea that the tax system is steeped in systemic racism, and they seem to do all but begging for another test case to come along so that they can pull a McCleary on the entire tax system of Washington State. In other words, tell the legislature, you need to change this because we say you need to change this.
Yeah, whether or not the incidence of a tax is on income or a transaction, that's a very clear, that's a very simple analysis. All of that other commentary, all of that other rhetoric is irrelevant to that decision. The fact that that was in the opinion is what causes concern going forward. Because while the dissent very clearly said our prior holdings that income is property, and our prior holdings that the proper way to bring the state of Washington to graduated income taxes with the constitutional amendment, something the voters have already rejected 6 times, that was only in the dissent. The majority went out of their way. And while they didn't do it in this ruling, they didn't go to what the Washington Education Association was asking for and go ahead and strike that determination that we own our income and allow the legislature today to do a graduated income tax. That majority opinion all but begged the legislature to send them a new test case so they can do that. They clearly have the appetite for that. There's probably not time in this session for the legislature to do that, but that's what you're going to have to keep an eye on now going forward, is for that test case to come and see if we're going to have a broader income tax brought to the state of Washington by passing a constitutional amendment.
There's a question here for you, Jason. Any state appeals possible after the capital gains income tax ruling by the Supreme Court, or is there only the possibility of federal appeal via the Commerce Clause?
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court, it's Judge Dredd, right? They are the law. This is the opinion now for the state of Washington, even though it's an opinion that doesn't exist anyplace else on the planet, but that's where we are today. So for purposes of is this a property tax that violates the state constitution, that's solely a state interpretation. Where there is the potential for a federal challenge, you have 41 other states that have income taxes, and you have 41 other states, therefore, that tax capital gains income. But when you are a resident of a state, you can be taxed regardless of where that income was generated. And that's why those taxes on capital gains across the country don't have a federal violation. If you're going to say, however, that this is not an income tax, this is an excise tax. Well, excise taxes tax transactions, tax activities. A state cannot tax activities across its borders. So since we're now, as a state of Washington, saying we are reaching across our boundaries and taxing activities in other states, that is arguably a Commerce Clause violation. So you could see a federal challenge. If I was a federal judge, though, I would just say, this is an income tax. There's no problem.
Another question, this from Cindy. How can they pass this when our state constitution does not allow for a state income tax? How do we get it overturned? That's the $1 million question right there.
So again, this is the determination of our state Supreme Court. This is how this tax will be interpreted for our jurisprudence and for the legislative process. So the option now is a ballot measure to repeal it, or a ballot measure to try to redefine back to the common nomenclature across the country that this is an income tax. The other thing that we're going to need to keep an eye on with this ruling is this is for the first time that the Supreme Court has held that an excise tax can be measured based upon net gain, measured based upon income. So the tax you're going to really want to keep an eye on going forward is the real estate excise tax. That is currently truly an excise tax, right? You're being taxed on the sale of your home. But now that the court said that you can have an excise tax based upon net gain, that is a potential tax you want to keep an eye on to see what kind of mischief the legislature might have.
And with property values, what they are, you could net a gain of even $500,000 on a home. And all that gets you is the ability to buy another home, somewhere in Western Washington. It used to mean real money and now not so much. So, and we should point out that before the ink was dry on this particular capital gains tax, there was efforts this year to reduce the threshold, from $250,000 to what was it, Jason?
To 15,000.
To 15,000. I mean, so the direction this is going. Plus, as you point out, if it's based on the net proceeds of the transaction, and they're still calling it the transaction tax, I don't see where that ends. I mean, if you're if you're able to twist the very clear language of the court and the very clear language of the tax and the definitions, I wouldn't rely on the court to be fair, as in play by the rules on anything. And I know that's there's people that can make hay out of that, but I mean, look, just because somebody an authority tells me a dog's a cat or a cat's a dog doesn't mean I'm going to buy it, right? So
Dave, I've never been accused of being too optimistic about what the state of Washington is doing, but I mean, we've had these conversations over the years. I am truly shocked. I thought that this was so clear that even our court could not go sideways on it, and 7 of them did. So I think the other thing that going forward we need to realize, the court is in full policymaking mode. We right now have 3 branches of government that make policy. There's not an impartial referee at this point on the legality of state taxes. And that may mean that, just like you have with the races for the legislature and the races for the governor, these races for state Supreme Court need to get a lot more attention.
Yes. And that's really tough because, frankly, whenever you're in a judicial race, judges don't say anything. They act like they have no opinion about anything. They'll say, well, look at me, I've got all kinds of credentials, and the other person, doesn't, because they're not, as left-wing as me or whatever. And it's really tough to learn anything. So, that's a big hill to climb. Here's a question from Armin. If the tax is really an excise tax, shouldn't it be on the gross amount of a stock sale transaction, as is the case with the real estate excise tax, versus on the amount of gain subject to exemptions? This may have already been stated, but it seems like another angle on the idiocy of the decision.
Yes, Armin, that's what exists everywhere else in the world. But again, that's not what our Supreme Court decided. If you listen to the rhetoric of the capital gains tax supporters and the majority opinion, what they are describing is a financial transaction tax, a tax applied at point of sale or exchange on the value or volume of a capital asset. That's an excise tax. That's entirely constitutional. Prepare to be amazed. A tax on income is an income tax. You don't sell, you don't exchange capital gains. They are the income derived from other activities, which is why everyone else will tell you it's an income tax. And this is where, again, you're going to need to pay attention to our existing excise taxes, and in particular the REIT, because this is a monumental change in tax policy in the state of Washington to say that you can have an excise tax based upon income, based upon net gain. So that door is now open, and lawmakers are creative. So that's where you're going to have to really have a lot of vigilance.
Next question from Robert on the income tax. Any discussions yet about an initiative to invalidate the implementing law? Is this appealable to the federal Supreme Court? I'll just add, we're a 501c3, so the initiative is not, it's not going to come from Washington Policy Center. But the question there is it appealable? You mentioned that already with the federal Supreme Court. And I am sure that that organizations and others will be taking a look. Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, again, you will probably see a federal challenge, but it's a Hail Mary. Just to be honest with you, it's a Hail Mary. The most likely response will be a ballot measure, and you'll just have to see how that takes shape.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see that Hail Mary, and then the justices say, yeah, we'll just take this one. It's a one-word ruling. Wrong. That's about it, because I've been calling it it's like linguistic camouflage for what the tax really is, or political camouflage for a policy that was desired, and it's pretty clear to people who I think want to look at it objectively. Anyway, Jason, as always, you did great work. I know this has got to be frustrating for you, having devoted so much of your working life to this particular issue with such passion over the years. But look, it's not over yet. It's the push goes on, and I guess most of this lands with the in the hands of the voters of the state of Washington and the people, if they want to hold elected officials accountable, including justices.
Yeah, and ironically, this ruling probably means that we won't see too many tax games played in the existing budgets, right? Both the House and the Senate budgets have come out, and the Senate budget came out before the ruling. So they actually left capacity in their reserves had this been overturned. Basically, what that means is currently neither of these budgets have tax increases in them. And, I guess, and a silver lining of the court having upheld this tax is now there's not any discussions about using a struck down income tax as an excuse to raise other taxes, at least yet.
Yeah, I'm sure they're willing to, nothing's ever quite dead in the legislature, and so don't give them any ideas on that score. One quick thing though, we've already seen some movement. It turns out that as you pointed out, when Governor Jerry Brown was governor of California again, he pointed out that the capital gains tax was a volatile source of income for the state and led to a lot of budget problems because people move and capital goes. There's a roller coaster effect to the gains issue. Your thoughts on the announcement from Fisher Investments that they're changing headquarters, keeping in mind that the newspaper is very careful to say that the investor had already said, well, it doesn't mean that much about a headquarters changing because it's just something on paper. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was interesting to see the governor's Casablanca moment. They were shocked that a business would relocate for tax purposes. Unfortunately, this is going to be the first of many because over the last few years, it's not only those that may leave, but those that never came. I was fielding phone calls from California businessmen and women looking to flee the state and telling me, I'd love to come to Washington. Washington is a much prettier state than Nevada or Texas. But what's going to happen here with this case? I'm not sure you're a safe bet anymore. So I guess I'm not going to have to go to Nevada or Texas. So it's not only those that are leaving, but those that never come. And the response from the governor's office and from other people hearing about this has been like, oh, we don't need them. They should go. We don't want those type of people here. Well, you have the multiplier effect of all of the employees, the B&O tax, the sales tax, the property tax. I don't understand this viewpoint that we only want the right businesses in the state of Washington and not those that are concerned about their profitability.
Also, the way they frame it was, I'm shocked that they wouldn't want to pay a tax for children, and you think, okay, how many billions of dollars in surplus revenue have we had? And what has been the reduction of the state sales tax, the thing that hits middle and lower income people the most with their families? And how many cuts to the state sales tax have we received since 1982, 40 years ago? The answer is zero, right?
Yeah, we've had the amount of tax relief as there has been voter support for an income tax. None. And the interesting thing about this is the response after this ruling came down from the lawmakers that were advocating for this tax wasn't, oh, great, now we have the capacity for a sales tax cut or a property tax cut. No, the response was, all right, let's do the wealth tax. Let's double down.
Yeah. There's even prior to session, remember, majority leadership was asked specifically about reducing the state sales tax, and the attitude expressed was, well, we want to be able to target and plan and control what kind of benefits people get and who gets them, as though somehow they know, what struggles people are going through at all levels. I mean, I know when I'm paying groceries now, I feel it very strongly. And so it's a frustrating thing to see. Jason, really appreciate your work. As always, we appreciate you supporting us at Washington Policy Center. We'll continue our efforts against this ridiculous and unfair taxation. Our aim is to keep Washington income tax free, and that has not changed. So you can stay tuned with Washington Policy Center for more news and information. We'll be tracking any new taxes that come up. Jason's the best I've ever known at that, and always appreciate that information. And we'll keep you updated as well.